Adelaide Monroe looked at the crumpled bill in her palm and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November rain soaking through her coat. There, pressed between fingers that had spent 40 years turning the pages of library books, sat a single dollar. It was all that remained of a lifetime of careful choices. Behind her, huddled in the passenger seat of a Buick older than her granddaughter, 16-year-old Juniper pressed her forehead against the fog glass and tried to hide the tears her grandmother was never supposed to see. The man who had done this to them, Trent Schaefer, her late daughter's brother-in-law, the one who had smiled across Addie's kitchen table and called her Aunt Addie while he slid the power of attorney forms across the varnish, had disappeared across the state line with every dollar she had, the deed to the house Clement had built her, and the last shred of dignity she'd been able to carry out the front door. Everyone in Fernwood Hollow laughed when they saw Addie walk into that emergency county auction with nothing but a wet bill and a girl she had no idea how to keep sheltered. She bought a grave, they told each other, phones already out, already posting. A sunken heap of nothing that the Pawnee River had been trying to swallow for 3 floods running. But what none of those smiling faces of the courthouse understood, what Garrison Ledbetter himself would spend the next year of his life trying to bury all over again, was that the same floodwater everyone had written off as a curse had quietly, patiently, over the course of a century, washed something loose beneath the floorboards of 84 Old Crossing Road. Something a Swedish farmer named Magnus Everhart had sealed in stone in the summer of 1905 and left waiting for someone the world had already given up on. If you have ever been told your story was over, if anyone has ever laughed at the last thing you had left, stay with me to the end of this one, because what Adelaide Monroe pulled from the silt beneath that farmhouse is going to remind you that the same water that drowns you can sometimes surface what you were always meant to inherit. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Welcome to Dreams Don't Age. Subscribe now and join our family of resilient souls, because today you're going to see how an elderly widow, a grieving teenager, and a single soaking wet dollar became the instrument of a reckoning 120 years in the making. Fernwood Hollow, Arkansas, is the kind of town that doesn't show up on weather apps until the water rises. It sits at a low bend of the Pawnee River, tucked between the pine hills of the Ouachita foothills and a long stretch of bottomland that floods every few years whether the county wants to admit it or not. People in Fernwood Hollow have always divided themselves into 2 groups. On the high side of Route 9, the land is dry and the old family's names sit on the bank buildings, the feed store, and the main pew at First Methodist Church. On the low side, the houses are smaller, the floods come fast, and the flood insurance costs more than the mortgages. Adelaide Monroe had lived on the low side of Route 9 for 22 over 71 years, in a 2-bedroom home with yellow shutters that she and her husband Clement had paid off the year he turned 60. For 31 of those years, Addie had been the head librarian at Fernwood Hollow Memorial Library, 2 warm rooms of polished oak and quiet shells that she had run with the kind of gentle authority only women who have raised a child alone through a long illness ever manage to muster. She had never expected to be rich. She had never expected to be poor either. What she had expected was to live out her last years on that porch she and Clement had painted together the summer before he was diagnosed, and to watch her only daughter, Helen, grow older beside her own little girl, Juniper, and maybe one day, if God was kind, hold a great grandbaby on the braided rug where 3 generations of Monroes had spilled their breakfast oatmeal. That was the life she had expected. That was the life Trent Schaefer had calmly, professionally, and with a smile every single time, taken apart piece by piece over the course of 18 quiet months. He had not robbed her the way a stranger robs a bank. He had robbed her the way a termite eats a house, one soft bite at a time. So slow you don't believe the damage is real until the wall you've leaned against your whole life suddenly gives way beneath your hand. Before we walk back into that rain and that laughter and what Addie found beneath the silt at 84 Old Crossing Road, you need to understand the woman she was before the auction, because the person who bid on that drowning farmhouse was not a desperate woman. She was a patient one. And patience, as Magnus Everhart had once written in a journal that nobody would read for 120 years, is a thing rivers understand better than men. Adelaide had grown up on the low side of Route 9, the only daughter of a pipe fitter named Robert and a beautician named Eunice, in a wood-frame house half a mile from the one she would later share with Clement. Her parents were not wealthy, but they were readers. Her father kept paperback westerns stacked beside the toolbox in his work truck, and her mother read mystery novels between appointments at the salon her cousin ran behind the Piggly Wiggly. Books were what had made Addie feel safe as a child, and the Fernwood Hollow Memorial Library, a sturdy brick building on the corner of Cypress and 4th, was the first place she ever walked to alone. She was 11 this summer. She decided she was going to be the woman who sat behind that front desk one day. She was 24 when she finally got her wish, hired on as an assistant librarian 3 weeks after she married Clement Monroe in the small stone chapel at the edge of town. Clement was a quiet man, a heating and cooling technician from over in Piney Grove who had come in her checkout line one Saturday looking for a book on small engine repair and come back the next Saturday with no book at all, just a question about whether she liked catfish. He was not a handsome man in the obvious way. He was handsome in the way good wood is handsome, plain and honest, and the same every time you looked at it. They were married in 1979. She never once had to wonder where he was. For 42 years, they built the small good life that quiet people build when no one is watching. A garden out back, a yellow porch, a Sunday routine that involved a long drive and 2 ice creams. A fund in the credit union that Clement added to every payday from a little metal box on top of the refrigerator, because he said a woman ought to have something of her own even when she had him. Their daughter Helen was born in 1984, a late gift after 4 years of trying and 2 losses Addie had never quite stopped carrying her chest. Helen grew up reading in the same library her mother ran, cross-legged between the stacks with a book open in her lap. She became a kind, steady woman who taught 3rd grade over at Cedar Bluff Elementary. She married a soft-voiced contractor from Little Rock named David, and they gave Addie the only grandchild she would ever have. Juniper, named for the tree at the corner of Addie's yard, was born on a bright February morning. Clement lived long enough to teach that baby how to shell peas on the back porch. And then, in the spring of 2017, a diagnosis came that the two of them faced exactly the way they had faced everything else. Quietly. Together. He died 8 months later with her hand on his and a Louis L'Amour novel open on the nightstand. The library gave her 6 weeks of bereavement. She came back in 4, because the silence of the house was louder than the silence of the stacks. She retired 2 years later at 68 and thought she had already met her last grief. She was wrong. On a Wednesday evening in March, Helen and David were driving home from a school board meeting when a pickup truck ran the stop sign at Caddo Ridge. Addie was watching a rerun with 11-year-old Juniper asleep under a quilt beside her when a sheriff's car pulled up outside. Nothing in a woman's life prepares her to bury her only child. Nothing at all prepares her to bury that child's husband the same week. The funeral was on a Tuesday. Juniper did not speak for 6 days. And Addie, because grief does not excuse you from what needs doing, signed the guardianship papers, moved the girl's bed into the spare room, and began the slow work of learning how to raise a grandchild on a pension meant for 1 widow and 1 cat. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For 4 years, they managed. Addie stretched every dollar Clement had tucked into that metal box. She kept the yellow house in good repair, kept Juniper in the good school, kept her voice steady when the bills came in and the roof needed patching and the old Buick needed a new alternator. She made a life out of careful arithmetic, the way she had always made a life. And it was in the 5th year, the year Juniper turned 16 and started dreaming out loud about college, that a polite, well-dressed man in a navy blazer knocked on the yellow door and introduced himself as family. Trent Schaefer was David's younger brother. Addie had met him exactly twice before that afternoon. Once at Helen and David's wedding in 2011, where he had given a short, charming toast and then spent the rest of the reception on his phone out by the parking lot. And once at the double funeral, where he had stood at the back of the chapel in a black suit that fit him a size too well, shook her hand without looking at her, and been gone before the reception cleared. In the 5 years since, he had sent a Christmas card exactly once, a glossy thing with a photograph of himself on a sailboat, signed simply Uncle Trent. Juniper had laughed at it and stuck it on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a frog. Now he was standing on her porch in a navy blazer, holding a leather folder and a bouquet of grocery store carnations, telling her he had been thinking about his brother for months, and it was time he did the right thing by his niece. Addie, who had spent a lifetime trusting her instincts inside the safety of a library and had never once had to read a man like this, let him in. He sat at her kitchen table and ate 2 slices of her pound cake and talked the way people who sell things for a living talk, steady and warm and never quite landing long enough on any one sentence for her to examine it. He told her he worked in financial consulting out of Memphis. He told her he had realized, looking at the paperwork of David's small estate, that Juniper's trust had been set up sloppily by a country lawyer and was losing money to fees every single month. He told her he wanted to help. He told her he knew she was proud, that he would never dream of taking anything from her, that he only wanted to be the kind of Uncle David would have wanted him to be. Then he slid the folder across the varnish and opened it to a tab page and handed her a pen and pointed to a line. It was a durable power of attorney. Over Juniper's trust. Over Addie's own accounts, too, he explained, because the IRS now treated guardianship finances and personal finances as a single reporting entity, and he needed access to both to keep everything clean. He said those words, keep everything clean, 3 different times. He said them the way a man says a prayer he doesn't quite believe, but needs you to believe. She signed. On a Saturday afternoon in her own kitchen, with a plate of pound cake between them and a photograph of Clement smiling down from the top of the refrigerator, Adelaide Monroe signed her life over to a man she had met twice. He was good. She had to give him that later, lying awake in the dark, replaying it. He was very, very good. The first 3 months, he sent her itemized statements. Little gains, small reassurances. He called every other Sunday and asked about Juniper's grades. He sent the girl a birthday card with $50 in it. He set up what he called a consolidated household account at a bank Addie had never heard of, and he moved Clement's metal box money into it. And he moved Juniper's trust into it, and he moved the small pension Addie drew every month into it. And he told her it was all for tax efficiency and that she could still use her old debit card exactly the way she always had. The card started getting declined at the grocery store in August. Small amounts at first. $43 for groceries. $61 at the pharmacy. Trent had answers. System migration. Fraud holds. A software update at the bank. He would transfer funds immediately, he said. Every time, 2 or 3 days later, the card worked again. Addie, who had balanced a checkbook by hand for 50 years, began to feel the first low hum of something being wrong the way a person senses a storm before the clouds have rolled over the ridge. In September, the mortgage company called. 3 missed payments. Addie had never missed a mortgage payment in her entire adult life. Clement had paid off the original loan in 2010. There was no mortgage. There should have been no mortgage. There was a mortgage. Trent had taken one out against the yellow house in June, using the power of attorney she had signed for $187,000. The money was gone. The account was empty. The pension deposits from the past 2 months had been redirected to a different account in a different state. Juniper's trust, the small one Helen and David had so carefully built for their daughter's college, had been liquidated in a single wire transfer on the morning of August 11th. Addie sat in her kitchen with the phone still in her hand and looked at the photograph of Clement on the refrigerator and understood, finally and completely, that the termite had already finished with the wall. The next 4 months were the kind a woman does not describe out loud, not even to the people who love her, because describing them would mean admitting they were real. Addie called the sheriff's office. She called the bank. She called a legal aid hotline in Little Rock and waited on hold for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Trent Schaefer's Memphis phone number was disconnected by the end of that first week. His office turned out to be a rented mailbox in a strip mall next to a nail salon. The bank that held the fraudulent mortgage, a regional lender that had issued the loan based on documents he had signed under her power of attorney, informed her with a great deal of sympathy and no flexibility whatsoever that the debt was legally hers. A fraud investigation would take 18 to 24 months. Foreclosure proceedings, in the meantime, would continue on schedule. She did not tell Juniper for 3 weeks. She told her the night the foreclosure letter was taped to the yellow door. They sat on the porch Clement had painted, the two of them, with the taped notice fluttering between them in the December wind, and Addie held her granddaughter's hand and explained as plainly as she knew how that they had 30 days and that she was going to find them somewhere to go, and that no matter what happened next, she was not going to let anything separate them. Juniper, who had been silent for 6 days the week her parents died, did not cry. She looked at her grandmother for a long time and then said, "Grandma, we'll figure it out. We always do." And Addie, who had not cried in front of the girl once in 5 years, went inside and shut the bathroom door and sat on the edge of the tub and cried into a hand towel for 20 minutes, and then came out and made them both grilled cheese sandwiches for supper. She sold what she could: Clement's tools, her mother's wedding china, the porcelain bird collection her aunt had left her in 1996. It came to just under $2,000, which paid for a short-term rental on the edge of town and 3 weeks of groceries and gas. And then, on a cold Tuesday morning in early November, Adelaide Monroe opened her wallet at the Fernwood Hollow gas station and counted what was left of a lifetime: $1. A single wrinkled bill that had been folded inside an old birthday card from Clement and had somehow survived every emptying of every purse she had owned since he died. She was sitting in the Buick in the gas station parking lot, staring at that dollar, when she saw the county notice taped inside the window of the courthouse across the street. Emergency tax auction, flood damaged and condemned properties. Today, 2 p.m. The county, she knew, held an auction like this every few years after a bad flood season, trying to clear abandoned parcels off the books before they became a liability. She had read about them in the paper. She had never imagined attending one. She imagined it now. She got there at 1:45. The auction was held in the basement meeting room of the Fernwood Hollow courthouse, a low-ceilinged space with folding chairs and the smell of old coffee. 40 or so people were already seated, most of them men she recognized from the high side of Route 9. Real estate investors, a few contractors, 2 of the Ledbetter cousins from the bank, which surprised her only for a second. Someone in the back row saw her walk in, and she heard the whisper travel the room the way whispers do in small towns. "That's Addie Monroe, the librarian, the one Trent Schaefer cleaned out." A few phones came up. A few came down. She found a seat in the back corner, between an empty chair and a radiator, and folded her hands at her lap over the single-dollar bill. Hollis Pettigrew, the county clerk, ran the auction with the bored efficiency of a man doing his 9th one. He moved through the first properties quickly. A burned-out mobile home lot in the West County went for $3,200. A pair of abandoned acres near the interstate went for $12,000. A gutted duplex on Magnolia went for $17,500. Addie watched each hammer fall on numbers that may as well have been the moon. And then, near the end of the list, Pettigrew cleared his throat and looked at his paperwork and said, almost to himself, "All right, folks. Last one. This is the problem child. 84 Old Crossing Road. 2-story farmhouse on 1.8 acres. Built 1898. Structure is condemned. Sits in the 100-year floodplain and has flooded in 3 of the last 4 springs. No insurable value. County's been trying to offload this one for 11 years. Somebody in the front row laughed, the short, embarrassed laugh of a man who has just been reminded of a joke everyone already knew. Pettigrew sighed. "Opening bid," he said, $500. Nobody moved. Pettigrew, who had clearly expected this, did not even look up from his clipboard. $300, he said. Silence. 2. A man in the second row laughed out loud this time. "Hollis," he called. "The county ought to be paying somebody to take that thing." A rustle of agreement moved through the room. Pettigrew pinched the bridge of his nose. "The county has authorized me," he said, with the flat patience of a man who had delivered this exact speech at this exact auction for more years than he cared to count, "to go as low as necessary to remove this property from the tax rolls. What will you give me for 84 Old Crossing Road?" Any offer accepted. Addie's hand went up before her mind had decided it would. $1, she said. The room went absolutely still. The kind of still a room only gets when 40 people simultaneously realize they have just heard something they will retell at dinner tables for the next 6 months. Then, one by one, the laugh started. Small at first, then building. One of the Ledbetter cousins in the front row turned completely around in his seat to look at her. A man she had once checked out a book to, Dale Pruitt from the hardware store, covered his face with both hands, shoulders shaking. "Ma'am," Pettigrew said carefully, the way a man speaks to someone he is not sure is entirely well. "Did you say $1? "Yes, sir," Addie said. Her voice was steady. It surprised her how steady. "It is what I have. You said any offer accepted. I am offering $1. Pettigrew looked around the room. "Any counterbids?" "Nothing." A few men shook their heads, still grinning. "All right then," he said, and brought the little wooden hammer down softly, almost apologetically. 84 Old Crossing Road, condemned farmhouse on 1.8 acres, sold to Mrs. Monroe for $1. See the clerk for the deed transfer. Somebody in the back clapped once, sarcastic and sharp, and then the laughter started up again in earnest as Addie stood and walked to the front of the room with her single bill held between her fingers the way a child holds a lost tooth. The young woman at the clerk's desk, a girl no older than 25 with a name tag that read BRI, took the dollar with visible embarrassment and slid a clipboard across to her. "Ma'am," she said quietly, while behind Addie the room began to empty and the jokes began to travel, "I have to tell you, that house is condemned. You can't legally occupy it. It's not safe. The last time it flooded, the water came up past the first floor windows." "I understand," Addie said. "I just need the deed and the key." Bree hesitated, then nodded, and produced a manila envelope and a single tarnished iron key on a loop of twine that looked like it had been cut in another century. "Good luck, ma'am," she said, and she meant it. By the time Addie reached the parking lot, her phone was already buzzing. 3 of the women from her old book club, a neighbor from the Yellow House Street, a cousin in Hot Springs who had seen something on Facebook. She did not answer any of them. She drove to the short-term rental, packed everything she and Juniper owned into 4 garbage bags and 2 suitcases in under 40 minutes, loaded them into the Buick, and told the girl, very simply, that they were going to their own house now. Juniper, who had been scrolling on her phone, went very still. "Grandma," she said, "they're posting about you. They're saying you bought." "I know what I bought," Addie said. "Get in the car." The drive to Old Crossing Road took 18 minutes. They passed out of town on Route 9, turned onto a gravel road that wound along the bottomland between 2 soybean fields, and came over a low rise just as the late afternoon light was starting to go orange. Juniper drew in a breath. Addie took her foot off the gas. 84 Old Crossing Road sat at the bottom of a shallow bowl of land, where the Pawnee River had decided, 120 years ago, that it would occasionally like to visit. The farmhouse was 2 stories of weathered clapboard, once white, now the color of wet paper bags. A wraparound porch sagged at the southeast corner where a post had given out. The front yard was a churned plain of dried silt, cracked into hexagons by the sun, studded with the black skeletons of drowned shrubs. A thin line ran around the entire outside of the house at about 4 feet off the ground, the kind of line only floodwater leaves. The windows on the first floor were boarded with plywood gone gray at the edges. The roof bowed in the middle like the spine of an old dog. Somewhere inside, something dripped. Juniper, 16 years old and very brave, said, "Oh, Grandma." And Addie, 71 years old and very tired, said, "I know. Get the bags." The iron key turned in the lock on the first try, which was the first small mercy of Addie's evening. The front door swung inward with a long groan, and the smell hit them both at once. River silt, old wood, and the sweet rotten odor of a house that had been underwater more than once and never properly dried. Addie clicked on the flashlight she grabbed from the Buick's glove box. The beam cut through the dim and found a wide entry hall with water-stained wainscoting up to her waist, a staircase rising to a second floor she would not be letting Juniper near tonight, and in the back, a wide doorway into what had once been a farm kitchen. The first floor was, against every expectation, salvageable. Filthy beyond description, furred with dried silt and the curled paper of wallpaper that had given up decades ago, but the joists beneath their feet were solid oak that had outlasted 4 generations of neglect. The second floor was a different story. The ceiling in the parlor sagged in a way Addie did not care to test, and water stains bloomed down the upstairs walls like maps of countries that did not exist. She chose a small back room off the kitchen, a pantry or summer kitchen originally, with a door that closed and a brick floor that had drained where the rest of the house had pooled. They swept it out with a broom Addie found leaning behind the stove. They laid down the blankets from the Buick. Addie lit a battery lantern she had bought for $2 at the Dollar General 3 weeks earlier when she first understood the shape of what was coming. And in that small circle of yellow light, with the November wind moving through the boards overhead, she and Juniper ate cold sandwiches and did not speak. Juniper fell asleep first, curled against her grandmother's side under a quilt that had been on Clement's bed the night he died. Addie sat awake for a long time, listening to the old house settle around them, and understood, somewhere around 2 in the morning, that she was not afraid. She was not happy. She was not hopeful. She was something simpler than all of those. She was home in a way she could not explain, in a house she had owned for 7 hours, and she did not try to explain it. She slept. They woke to the kind of cold gray light that only November mornings in Arkansas produce. Addie made instant coffee on a camp stove. Juniper, who had apparently decided overnight to be practical, announced she was going to help clean. They started in the farm kitchen because cleaning is what Addie had always done when she did not know what else to do, and because a working kitchen is the first thing any house needs to begin being a house again. They swept silt. They hauled out the ruined remains of a chicken wire pantry. They cleared a drift of dried mud from the corner where the back door met the outer wall. And it was there, on the third afternoon, in the corner where the silt had been deepest and therefore the floor had been most protected, that Juniper's broom caught on something that was not floor. "Grandma," she said, "there's a seam." Addie got down on her knees, which at 71 was not a casual commitment, and swept the last of the silt aside with her bare hand. Beneath the grime was a rectangle of stones set into the brick floor, about 2 feet by 3 feet, the edges filled with what had once been mortar and was now, after a century of flooding, nothing but a soft brown line of dirt. One corner was already tilted upward, a quarter of an inch above the rest of the floor. The last flood had lifted it. The water, finding no other way out of the low corner, had pushed up from beneath. Addie and Juniper looked at each other. "Go get the crowbar from the back of the Buick," Addie said. The stone came up with more patience than force. It was heavier than it looked, a slab of sandstone cut by hand a very long time ago, and when it finally lifted free, they set it aside and shone the flashlight into the hole beneath. A stairway. 7 narrow stone steps descending into a small chamber that the floodwater, impossibly, had not reached. Addie could see it at once by the dryness of the air rising out of the hole. Whoever had built this space had built it to stay sealed. The mortar around the slab had been sloped outward, not inward, so that water pushing down ran off and away. For 120 years, every flood that had tried to drown this house had instead, patiently, washed the dirt off the edges of that stone. Addie went down first, one careful step at a time, with the flashlight held out ahead of her. At the bottom, on a small oak table black with age, but dry as bone, sat a leather-bound journal, an iron-strapped wooden chest, and an oilcloth bundle tied with wax twine. The journal's cover, when she lifted the flashlight to it, bore 3 letters stamped deep into the leather. MLE. Addie sat on the bottom step of the little stone staircase with the journal on her lap, and opened it with the care of a woman who had handled 10,000 books in her life and recognized at once that this one was a survivor. The paper was brittle at the edges, but the ink, iron gall by the look of it, was as black as the day it had dried. The first page, in a slow, careful hand that had clearly learned English as a second language, read, "The private journal of Magnus Everhart, begun on this the 3rd day of April, in the year of our Lord 1898, upon the occasion of my taking possession of 160 acres of bottomland along the Pawnee River, purchased lawfully from the United States Land Office at Little Rock." Juniper, kneeling beside her with the flashlight, said quietly, "Grandma, read out loud." So Addie did. For the next 3 hours, by the light of a battery lantern in a dry stone room beneath a drowned farmhouse, Adelaide Monroe read the life of a Swedish farmer who had crossed an ocean at 21, worked 7 years in a Minnesota flour mill, and brought his savings south to Arkansas because a man at the land office had told him the bottomland along the Pawnee could grow anything a man asked it to. Magnus had built the house with his own hands over the spring and summer of 1898. He had married a Fernwood Hollow schoolteacher named Cora in 1901. He had buried an infant son in 1903. And in the late summer of 1905, while digging a new well on the west edge of his property, Magnus Everhart had struck a seam of native silver as thick as his own forearm. He had done, he wrote, what a cautious man does. He had taken samples to an independent assayer in Hot Springs rather than to the bank in Fernwood Hollow. He had filed a mineral claim with the state in Little Rock rather than with the county clerk. And he had sat down the evening after he filed it and written in this journal the sentence Addie, now read aloud with a voice that had begun to shake. I do not trust the Ledbetters. They have watched me come and go from the land office twice this month, and today young Ellis Ledbetter rode out past my gate 3 times before supper, looking at nothing. 2 weeks later, Magnus Everhart was found face down in the Pawnee River half a mile downstream from his own property, his pockets empty, his rifle gone. The county sheriff, a Ledbetter cousin by marriage, ruled it an accidental drowning. A will Magnus had never written was produced within 48 hours, leaving the entire 160 acres, free of any mineral reservation, to the Fernwood Hollow Farmers and Merchants Bank in settlement of a debt Magnus had never owed. Cora, pregnant with her second child and alone in a country not her own, signed what she was told to sign and was gone back to Minnesota before Christmas. The bank subdivided the land. The Ledbetter family kept the west acreage where the well was and built what became, over the next 120 years, the largest privately held silver operation in southern Arkansas, a thing they had carefully and deliberately never advertised under their own name. The farmhouse and its 1.8 acres of useless floodplain was sold and resold and eventually abandoned. Nobody ever found the seller. Nobody ever looked. Why would they? It was a drowning house on a drowning lot, and the only thing the Ledbetters had ever wanted from it was for it to quietly disappear. Addie closed the journal. Her hands were trembling. Juniper, beside her, was not breathing. They opened the iron chest. Inside, wrapped in layer after layer of oilcloth, were the things Magnus Everhart had hidden on the last night of his life. The original deed from the United States Land Office, dated 1898, bearing the seal of President McKinley's administration. The filed mineral claim from the state of Arkansas, dated August 1905, stamped and recorded. 3 assay certificates from an independent firm in Hot Springs, each one attesting to native silver of a grade the modern reader, Addie would later learn, would describe as extraordinary. For small linen sacks of, or samples, heavy as sin, and at the bottom of the chest, folded inside a final sheet of oilcloth, a single notarized document in the same careful hand. In the event of my death by means other than natural, I, Magnus Everhart, being of sound mind, do hereby declare that the lawful heir to the mineral estate herein recorded shall be the person who, by honest purchase or inheritance, occupies the dwelling house I have built upon the parcel described above. Let whoever finds this finish what I cannot. Addie Monroe, 71 years old, sat on the bottom step of a stone staircase beneath a farmhouse she had bought for $1 and began, quietly, to laugh. Odette Winslow was a solo practice attorney out of a second-floor office above the Fernwood Hollow pharmacy who had, 5 years earlier, handled Clement's modest will for a flat $400 and a pecan pie. She was 56 years old, wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and kept on her desk a small cactus her mother had given her the week she passed the bar. She was not a flashy lawyer. She had never tried a case that had made a newspaper, but she had, in 31 years of practice, never once lost a client's trust, which in a town the size of Fernwood Hollow was a kind of fortune in itself. When Addie laid Magnus Everhart's documents across her desk 3 days after the discovery, Odette read for 20 minutes without speaking. She read the deed first, then the mineral claim, then the assay certificates, and then, very slowly, twice, the notarized declaration Magnus had written on the last night of his life. When she was finished, she got up, walked to her window, looked out at the courthouse across the square where 120 years earlier a forged will had been entered into probate, came back, sat down, and said, "Mrs. Monroe, do you understand what you have brought me?" Addie said she believed she did. Odette said she was going to take this case on contingency, that she would need 2 weeks to prepare the filing, and that Addie was effective immediately to stop talking about it to anyone who was not in this room. Then she stood up again, walked around the desk, and hugged Addie for a long time without saying anything further, which was not a thing Addie had ever seen Odette Winslow do before and which she would remember for the rest of her life. For the next 2 weeks, Odette and Rowan Prescott worked almost every night in the little office above the pharmacy, the blinds drawn, the lights on until 1 and 2 in the morning. Rowan, the Fernwood Hollow town historian, a soft-spoken retired schoolteacher who had spent 15 years quietly cataloging the irregularities in the county's 1905 land records, turned out to have been preparing, without knowing it, for exactly this case his entire adult life. He had cross-referenced every Ledbetter land acquisition between 1898 and 1915 against filed sale records in Little Rock. He had photocopies of 7 other probate filings from that period that bore the same handwriting as Magnus Everhart's forged will. He had, in a shoebox in his attic, an original 1906 photograph of Ellis Ledbetter standing in front of the very well Magnus had been digging the day he struck silver, taken less than a year after Magnus' death. When Odette saw that photograph, she sat down on the floor of her own office and did not get up for several minutes. They filed the quiet title action, joined to a claim on the mineral estate, in state court in Little Rock on a Tuesday morning in late December. Odette drove the 60 miles herself and hand-delivered the filing, because she did not trust the mail and because she wanted to see, with her own eyes, the clerk's stamp fall on the first page. Within 72 hours, the story was on the front page of the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette. Within a week, it was national. Retired Arkansas librarian buys condemned farmhouse for $1, claims ownership of century-old silver operation. The calls began within hours. Reporters, producers, 3 different Hollywood managers claiming to represent talent interested in the rights, for separate lawyers offering, for reasonable percentages, to take the case off Odette's hands. A cousin of Addie's in Hot Springs she had not spoken to in 11 years, who had thoughts about what would be fair. 2 of the women from her old book club, who had, she remembered, laughed on Facebook the day of the auction. Addie answered none of them. She gave exactly 1 interview to a quiet woman from the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette who had been the first reporter to call Odette rather than Addie directly. And in that interview, she spoke for 40 minutes not about silver, but about Magnus Everhart, and about Cora, and about the son they had buried, and about the life that had been taken from them before Addie had ever been born. Garrison Ledbetter came to Old Crossing Road himself. He arrived on a bright, cold morning in a black Range Rover that looked obscene against the silt, stepped onto the sagging porch in a cashmere overcoat that cost more than Addie's Buick, and offered Addie $300,000 cash that afternoon to make the whole thing go away. Addie, who had been scrubbing a windowsill when he drove up, did not invite him inside. She came out onto the porch, wiped her hands on her apron, and listened to him speak for almost 4 minutes without interrupting him once. He told her he understood she was a good woman who had been through hardship. He told her he respected her initiative. He told her that these kinds of old claims had a way of becoming terribly complicated when people let them. He told her, in the careful, rehearsed voice of a man who had closed a great many deals in his life, that $300,000 was a great deal of money for a woman in her position, and that he would hate to see her spend her remaining years in a courtroom. When he was finished, Addie looked at him the way she had looked for 40 years at children who had tried to slip a library book into a backpack unchecked, and she told him, in the same voice she had used for all those years, that she would see him in court. Juniper filmed the last 30 seconds of the conversation from the porch rail. It had 2 million views by the next morning. By the end of the week, it had 12. Trent Schaefer tried to reappear in February, through a cousin, through a lawyer, through a voicemail in which he called her Aunt Addie 4 times in 90 seconds. Odette Winslow answered that one personally. 6 weeks later, federal marshals arrested him outside a rented condominium in Gulf Shores, Alabama, on charges of wire fraud, mortgage fraud, and elder financial exploitation filed jointly by 3 different state attorneys general. Addie did not attend the arraignment. She did not write a victim impact statement. When the prosecutor's office called to ask if she wanted to, she said, very gently, that she had already spent enough of her life on Trent Schaefer, and that the paperwork would know what to say without her help. He received 11 years. She never spoke his name in Juniper's presence again. The hearing was in March. The judge, a woman from Fort Smith named Alvarez with no Fernwood Hollow ties and a reputation for reading every page of every filing, took the matter under advisement for 28 days. On day 29, Ledbetter's attorneys requested a settlement conference. On day 30, in a conference room on the 8th floor of an office building in Little Rock, with Odette on one side of a long table and 6 attorneys from a Dallas firm on the other, they offered $12 million, a permanent cessation of any claim on Old Crossing Road, and payment of all legal fees in exchange for Addie's release of all further claims against the mineral operation. Odette looked at Addie across the conference table. Addie looked at the framed photograph of Magnus Everhart, which Rowan had tracked down in a Minnesota County archive and which she had carried with her to every meeting since. She looked at it for a long moment, and then she said, very simply, he would want us to take it. He was a farmer. He never wanted to be rich. He wanted to be let alone. She said yes. Odette signed a release. The lead attorney from Dallas, a man who had not smiled once in 3 hours, shook Addie's hand and told her, quietly, that he had been practicing for 29 years and had never shaken the hand of a client on the other side that he respected more. Addie thanked him. She went downstairs. She sat in the Buick in the parking garage for 20 minutes before she could drive. She kept the farmhouse. She kept the 1.8 acres. She had the house restored by an honest crew out of Hot Springs, a small father and son operation Rowan had vouched for personally, and she visited the site every single day of the 4 months the work took. The sagging post was replaced. The roof was rebuilt with hand-split cedar, shingles the sun sourced from a mill in the Ozarks. The plywood came off the windows, and original glass was replaced with restoration glass that had the same faint wave to it as the surviving upper panes. The cellar was preserved exactly as they had found it, with a thick pane of tempered glass set into the pantry floor so that anyone standing in the kitchen could look down and see the little stone table and the iron chest and the journal, now in a climate-controlled case, exactly where Magnus had left them. Above the kitchen doorway, she hung the framed dollar bill and a small brass plaque that read, "The only dollar they forgot to steal." She also hung, on the wall opposite it, the 1906 photograph of Ellis Ledbetter standing in front of Magnus well, because she believed, as Magnus had believed, that the truth of a thing should never be allowed to quietly disappear. That summer, Addie flew to Minnesota for the first time in her life. Rowan had located, through 8 months of careful genealogical work, a great-great-granddaughter of Cora Everhart named Ingrid Halvorsen, a high school music teacher living outside Duluth who had grown up hearing a family story about a Swedish great-great-grandfather who had died in Arkansas under circumstances no one was ever allowed to ask about. Addie met her in a coffee shop in a town called Two Harbors. She brought photocopies of every page of Magnus' journal, the 1906 photograph, a single page from the original journal that Odette had agreed could, under the circumstances, travel home, and a check for $1 million, which was 1/12 of the settlement, and which she handed across the table without speech or ceremony. Ingrid Halvorsen, who was 44 years old and had never in her life heard her great-great-grandfather's first name spoken correctly in Swedish by anyone outside her own family, wept for 19 minutes in the booth of a coffee shop with strangers all around them, and Addie, who had wept very little in her own life, wept with her. She founded the Everhart Refuge the following autumn, a modest nonprofit operating out of the farmhouse itself, dedicated to emergency legal aid and short-term housing for elderly women who had been financially abused by members of their own families. The first woman they helped was named Dolores Petway, 78 years old, out of a town called Magnolia, whose son had, over the course of 2 years, taking exactly the same kind of power of attorney out of her kitchen that Trent had taken out of Addie's. The refuge got Dolores's home back, got her son prosecuted, and put her up in the small, renovated guest cottage behind the farmhouse for 6 weeks while her life was put back together. In its first year, the refuge helped 73 women. In its third year, 311. Rowan Prescott served on the board. Odette Winslow served as general counsel, free of charge, for as long as she practiced. Juniper Monroe graduated top of her class and left for college in the fall of the following year on a full scholarship she had earned herself because her grandmother insisted the trust money go to women who had no granddaughters left to fight for them. She chose to study forensic accounting. She had, she said, developed an interest. And Adelaide Monroe, 73 years old by then, sat on the yellow porch of the restored farmhouse every evening at dusk and watched the Pawnee River move, patient as it had always been, in the low bend of land that it had once tried so hard to drown. She did not plant a new garden. She planted the old one, the one whose outline Rowan had found in an 1899 survey map in a Little Rock archive, the same beds Cora Everhart had laid out in the first summer of her marriage, with rosemary at the corners and yarrow along the south fence. On still evenings, when the wind came up off the river and moved the long grass in the bottomland, Addie sometimes thought she could feel the house breathing around her, the way old houses do when they finally understand that someone has come home to stay. She would sit there until the last light went, and then she would go inside, and she would stand for a moment in the kitchen over the glass panel on the pantry floor, looking down at the little stone table where, for 120 years, a dead man had kept faith with a stranger he would never meet. Sometimes the water that you thought was taking everything from you is only washing the dirt off of what was always yours. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.